Roger Leadbeater was 74 years old. He drove a school bus for special needs children. Neighbors described him as gentle, decent, the kind of man who'd stop to help you without being asked. On August 9th, 2023, he took his dog Max for a walk in a park in Sheffield. It was a routine he'd followed for years, nothing unusual about it. But 48 hours earlier, a woman who had told authorities she wanted a bloodbath, a woman who believed she had been tricked by the devil, had been granted leave from a psychiatric intensive care unit. She had tried to escape 24 times before. She had already killed animals with a knife. She kept a hammer and rope in her flat alongside what staff described as a shrine of unicorns. Every warning sign you could possibly imagine was sitting right there in her file. And yet the system opened the door and let her walk straight into Roger Leadbeater's path. This is not just a crime story. This is the anatomy of a murder that was predicted, documented, and then allowed to happen. A murder that Roger's own family said was failed on every single level. And that phrase, failed on every single level, is not an emotional exaggeration. It is a factual summary of what an inquest later confirmed. Multiple institutions, multiple professionals, multiple chances to intervene. All of them missed, all of them insufficient. The coroner ruled Roger's death an unlawful killing. Prevention of future death reports were issued. But for the family, none of that brings Roger back. And none of it answers the question that hangs over this entire case like a shadow. How does a system that exists specifically to protect the public manage to fail this completely? To understand how this happened, you have to understand who Emma Borowy was. Not as a monster, but as a patient whose risk profile was thoroughly known and thoroughly ignored. Borowy was 32 years old at the time of the attack. She had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. She was a patient at the Wathwood Hospital, a medium-secure psychiatric unit in Rotherham, before being transferred to a psychiatric intensive care ward, a 6-bed unit designed for the highest-risk patients. Her history was not ambiguous. It was not a case where warning signs were subtle or hard to interpret. It was the opposite. Her file read like a countdown. Over the course of her time in psychiatric care, Borowy had absconded from facilities 9 times. She had attempted to abscond 15 more times on top of that. She had failed to return from authorized leave on 3 separate occasions. That's 27 incidents where she either broke out, tried to break out, or simply didn't come back when she was supposed to. 27. And that number alone should have been enough to make anyone pause before signing off on another period of leave. But it wasn't just the escapes. Borowy had previously killed 2 goats with a knife. She had demonstrated a fixation on violence that went beyond impulsive outbursts, a detail that might sound almost absurd in isolation, but which fits squarely into the delusional framework she was operating within. She spoke about ritual sacrifice. She spoke about the devil. She told people, in plain words, what she intended to do. And here's where the institutional failure begins to crystallize. Because all of this information existed, it was documented, it was in her records, it was known to clinicians, known to nursing staff, known to the system. The problem was not a lack of data. The problem was what happened, or rather, what didn't happen, with that data when it mattered most. 2 days before the murder, a new consultant psychiatrist authorized Borowy for escorted community leave. This was not a routine sign-off on a low-risk patient. This was a decision about a woman with one of the most alarming behavioral histories you could find in any psychiatric facility in the country, and the consultant made this decision without conducting a face-to-face review of Borowy, without completing a detailed, updated risk assessment. The inquest would later hear that this was a clear breach of established policy, the kind of policy that exists precisely because decisions like this one can have irreversible consequences. The consultant was new to the case. They did not have the depth of familiarity with Borowy's history that a face-to-face assessment would have at least partially provided, and yet the leave was authorized anyway. Think about that for a moment. A patient with 27 prior escape or absconding incidents, a patient who had killed animals with knives, a patient who had verbalized fantasies about bloodbaths and ritual sacrifice, and a brand new consultant signs off on community leave without even sitting in the same room as her. That is not a gray area. That is not a judgment call where reasonable people might disagree. That is a procedural failure with a body count. On August the 9th, Borowy was out on that authorized leave. She encountered Roger Leadbeater in a park in Sheffield while he was walking his dog, and she attacked him. The brutality of what happened next is difficult to convey without understating it. Roger suffered 124 separate injuries. 124. His wounds included injuries to his eye and skull, The coroner's report would later note that the only organ left intact in Roger's body was his heart. That detail alone tells you everything about the savagery of what was done to him. And through all of it, through every moment of that attack, Max, Roger's dog, never left his side. Even as Roger lay fatally wounded, Max stayed with him. That image of this loyal animal refusing to abandon his owner in the worst possible moment became one of the most emotionally devastating details of the entire case. It spoke to who Roger was, the kind of man whose dog loved him that much, and it spoke to the horror of what was taken from him and from his family. But the nightmare did not end with Roger's death, because when the Leadbeater family arrived at the scene of the murder, they found it uncleaned. The blood was still there, dog paw prints tracks through it. Another dog, not Max, was found licking the remains. The family had to witness the aftermath of the most violent thing that had ever happened to someone they loved, preserved in gruesome detail because nobody had thought to secure and clean the scene before they arrived. That is a layer of trauma on top of trauma. It is the kind of detail that doesn't make headlines as often as it should, because it speaks to a different kind of institutional failure. Not the failure that caused the death, but the failure to treat the survivors with even a basic level of care and dignity in the hours after. Now, the inquest into Roger's death laid bare the full scope of what went wrong, and it went far beyond one consultant's decision. The coroner, Tonika Rodden, described what happened as a domino effect, a chain of failures across multiple institutions that individually might have been survivable, but together created an outcome that was catastrophic and, in hindsight, almost inevitable. The failures stretched across three major bodies: the NHS trust responsible for Borowy's psychiatric care, and two separate police forces. And the critical breakdown between them was not just about individual mistakes. It was about information, or more precisely, the absence of it at the moments when it mattered most. When a psychiatric patient like Borowy is transferred between units, or when a new clinician takes over their care, there is supposed to be a handover, a transfer of knowledge about the patient's history, their risk factors, their behavioral patterns, the things that make them dangerous. In theory, this is how the system protects itself against the exact scenario that played out. In practice, these handovers are where lives get lost, because the information doesn't always travel with the patient. The urgency doesn't always transfer. The context, the feeling you get from sitting in a room with someone and hearing them talk about the devil and bloodbaths, that doesn't translate neatly into a file note. And when a new consultant picks up that file without the lived experience of managing this particular patient, gaps appear, dangerous gaps. This is what some analysts have called the information black hole, the space between institutions where critical knowledge goes to die. The NHS Trust had one set of information, the police forces had another. Nobody had the complete picture, and the protocols that were supposed to bridge those gaps either weren't followed or weren't sufficient even when they were. The coroner issued prevention of future deaths reports to the police forces involved. Notably, the initial reports did not include the NHS Trust, a decision that raised eyebrows given that many of the most significant failures occurred within the healthcare system. The family and advocacy groups pushed back on this, and the pressure for broader accountability continued well beyond the inquest itself. The Leadbeater family, supported by the charity 100 Families, an organization that works specifically with families affected by mental health homicides, called for a full public inquiry, not just an inquest, not just internal reviews. A proper, independent public inquiry with the power to compel testimony and access documents that internal reviews might never surface. Their argument was straightforward. The scale of failure here was too large and too systemic to be addressed by the same institutions that caused it. You cannot ask a system to investigate itself when the investigation is about whether that system is fundamentally broken. Roger's family made a statement that cut through the bureaucratic language and official apologies. They asked the people who were in positions of trust, the clinicians, the administrators, the police officers, to feel what it is like to live with the consequences of their decisions. That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a genuine plea for accountability from people who feel that the system treated Roger's life as less important than its own procedural convenience. And that word, convenience, matters here, because one of the uncomfortable questions that the inquest raised, but that no source has fully answered, is why. Why did a new consultant authorize leave without a face-to-face review? Was it because they were overworked? Was the 6-bed psychiatric intensive care ward understaffed? Were there resource pressures that made cutting corners feel like the only way to keep the system moving? None of the public reporting digs deeply into the structural conditions inside that unit at the time, and that's a significant gap, because if this was a case of one reckless individual making one bad call, that's one kind of problem. But if this was a case of a system so stretched that even well-intentioned professionals are making dangerous decisions because they don't have the time or the support to do their jobs properly, that's a completely different kind of problem. And it's the kind of problem that apologies and policy reviews don't fix. There's a concept in safety engineering called the Swiss cheese model. The idea is simple. Every layer of defense in a system has holes in it, like slices of Swiss cheese. Most of the time, the holes in one layer don't line up with the holes in the next layer, so the threat gets caught somewhere along the way. But occasionally, rarely but catastrophically, the holes line up perfectly, and the threat passes straight through every layer of defense without being stopped. That is exactly what happened on August the 9th, 2023. The hole in the NHS policy, a consultant who didn't conduct a face-to-face review, lined up with the hole in the risk assessment process, an outdated or incomplete evaluation of Borowy's current danger level, which lined up with the hole in the interagency communication, two police forces and an NHS trust not sharing information effectively, which lined up with the hole in the leave authorization process, no one flagging that this patient had 27 prior absconding incidents. Every single layer that was supposed to prevent this exact outcome had a gap in it, and every single gap was pointed in the same direction. Roger Leadbeater walked into that alignment, and he did not walk out. His family described Roger as the heart of the community. He wasn't a public figure. He wasn't someone whose name you would have known before August 2023. He was a man who drove special needs children to school because that was the kind of person he was. He walked his dog in the park because that was his routine. He lived a quiet, decent, useful life, and that life was taken from him not by random chance, not by an unforeseeable act of violence, but by a chain of specific, documented institutional choices that, taken together, made his murder not just possible but probable. Borowy herself told police after the attack that she believed she was performing a ritual sacrifice. She said she had been tricked by the devil. These are the words of a profoundly unwell person, and that fact does not excuse what she did, but it does raise an uncomfortable question about responsibility, because Borowy was not a free agent making rational choices. She was a patient. She was in the care of a system that knew exactly how dangerous she was. The system's job, its entire reason for existing, was to keep people like Borowy contained and people like Roger safe, and it did neither. The apologies came afterward, as they always do. Officials expressed regret. Reviews were promised. Lessons would be learned. But the Leadbeater family pointed out something that cuts through all of that. Apologies without structural change are just words, and words don't close the information black hole. Words don't staff a six-bed psychiatric unit properly. Words don't force a consultant to sit down with a patient before authorizing them to walk into a public park. The 100 Families charity, which has worked with the Leadbeaters throughout this process, has seen this pattern before. They have a database of cases where psychiatric patients on leave or who have absconded have gone on to kill members of the public, and in case after case the pattern is the same. Known risk, documented warnings, institutional failure, preventable death, official apology, promised reform, and then, often, the cycle repeats. The charity's position is that until there is genuine, independent oversight of these decisions, with real consequences for the institutions and individuals who get them wrong, nothing meaningful will change. The prevention of future deaths reports issued by the coroner are a mechanism designed to force change. They require the recipients, in this case the police forces, to respond within a set time frame, explaining what actions they have taken or plan to take to prevent similar deaths. But critics point out that these reports have no enforcement power. If the institutions respond with vague assurances and nothing changes, there is no penalty. There is no mechanism to compel compliance. The reports are, in effect, strongly worded suggestions, and when you are dealing with systemic failures that cost lives, strongly worded suggestions are not enough. The inquest heard testimony from over 60 pages of documentation, clinical records, police reports, handover notes, risk assessments that were either inadequate or missing entirely. The picture that emerged was not one of a single catastrophic error. It was one of a system that had been deteriorating for a long time, in ways that were visible to anyone who cared to look, but that nobody with the authority to intervene actually addressed. And this is the part that should concern everyone, not just the Leadbeater family, not just the people of Sheffield, but anyone who lives near a psychiatric facility, anyone who walks in a public park, anyone who trusts that the institutions responsible for managing dangerous individuals are actually doing their job. Because the question this case raises is not whether Emma Borowy was dangerous. Everyone knew she was dangerous. The question is whether the system we rely on to manage that danger is fit for purpose. And based on the evidence presented at this inquest, the answer is no. It was not fit for purpose on August the 9th, 2023, and without the kind of fundamental reform that the Leadbeater family is calling for, a public inquiry, independent oversight, genuine accountability, there is no reason to believe it is fit for purpose now. Roger Leadbeater's dog, Max, stayed by his side until the very end. That loyalty, that devotion, is the kind of thing that the system was supposed to match. Roger trusted the system to keep him safe the same way Max trusted Roger, and the system betrayed that trust in the most complete and devastating way imaginable. The true tragedy here is not just that Emma Borowy killed Roger Leadbeater. It's that she told people she was going to do something like this. The system recorded it, the system documented it, and then the system handed her the opportunity. Justice for Roger is not an apology. It is not a review. It is not a report that sits on a shelf. Justice for Roger is the closing of every gap, every black hole, every procedural shortcut that made his death inevitable. Before the next set of holes line up, before the next Roger Leadbeater walks into a park and doesn't come home. That's the full story for today. If you want more content like this, make sure you're subscribed and part of the community. I'll see you in the next video. Till then, goodbye and good night.